Thank you so much. And thank you for creating this opportunity to focus on the sacredness of nature. It seems appropriate in our time and age when nature is viewed as something outside of ourselves, something that becomes objectified and that we are disconnected from. And so trying to focus on the sacredness of nature, hopefully will help in a sense to heal this planet. So we would like to have this quote read from The Secret Doctrine.
No human-born doctrine, no creed, however sanctified by custom and antiquity, can compare in sacredness with the religion of nature. The key of wisdom that unlocks the massive gates leading to the arcana of the innermost sanctuaries can be found hidden in her bosom only.
Thank you. And that is the key point that we would like to share throughout this talk, is that what is expressed in nature are processes going on within ourselves. So the lotus is truly a universal symbol. It doesn't really matter where you turn your eyes, towards the east or towards the Middle East or towards the west. It is a universal symbol. And we hope that this small talk will be somewhat like an appetizer for each student to dive further into it and explore it more, because there is no possibility in such a short talk to cover all these different symbolism. But it is a symbol, you could say, of life, both spiritual and physical, of growth, of creativity, and of conscious godness. And if you take a look at the flower, isn't that incredibly beautiful? The ethereal quality that it has, because it has also been foremost of all a symbol for our spiritual journey. Now, if we turn towards India, for example, we see Vishnu seated in the crown of the lotus, and the lotus has always been a seat for the divine beings, to exemplify the culmination of the spiritual journey, you could say, and also to show that this is a fully realized spiritual being. This is, of course, Vishnu, one of the Trimurtis, but we also see other spiritual beings having their seat in the lotus, such as Buddha, for example. Another very prominent deity within Tibetan Buddhism or modern Buddhism is Avalokiteshvara Padmapani. And this, you could say, is the incarnation of compassion absolute. It is when the consciousness decides to manifest itself out of compassion, so afford every being, every sentient being, the opportunity of becoming spiritually realized. It's interesting to see that Avaloki in itself means the onlooker, or the atmic aspect, you could say, of our being, the spirit, the power to perceive, which never changes, which is the power to everything. And we can also see that Padmapani stands for our higher ego, that sentient reincarnating principle in us. That is what gives us the sense of identity, I am I, which continues from one life to the next and for the next. And it says that Padmapani, the one in the lotus, vowed never to cease working until he had made humanity feel his presence in himself and saved it from the misery of rebirth. So we can see that in the lotus symbol itself, we have the, you could say, the very essence of what we call the bodhisattvahood, or the capacity to become a fully realized being in order to be able to better help and serve others. Now, the lotus, if we turn to the Middle East, is also a sacred symbol with the old Egyptians, and especially the blue lotus. And you could see that the color blue in Egypt was very prominent. Of course, it was the color of the sky, but it was also color and significance of someone who had and worked from, you could say, the higher aspects of the mind. Here you see a pharaoh, and you can see that he's considered to be an illuminated being by the fact that he's wearing this blue wig. by the fact that he has his beard arranged in a certain way, and also because he has crowned his wig with his symbol, the crown of the lotus. And coming from the lotus would mean to come from the solar fields, to come from the spiritual world, and to come with wisdom into the world of, you could say, the lunar fields or the moon fields or the form fields, to share the knowledge and to guide the people from perspective of wisdom. Now we can also see that in the Christian tradition, the early Christian, we find the lotus flower, but now it has sort of more transformed itself into the water lily. And here in this painting of Leonardo da Vinci, we of course see the angel Gabriel, who is coming to let the Virgin Mother know that she's going to give birth to the Christ child through an immaculate conception. So you can say also that the lotus has, in one of its many aspects, represented fertility. Not only, of course, physical fertility, but foremost of all, spiritual fertility. How do we, so to speak, become fertilized in those spiritual ideas within us? So you could say foremost of all, then the lotus flower is, you could say, a symbol of our spiritual journey. And we've been told that it's very difficult to plant the lotus. It takes some concern, it needs to have certain type of flowing water. It doesn't thrive as well, we are told, in areas where there are sharp angles. You need rounded, circular surroundings. But once it buries its root deeply in the mud or in the soil, it is strong and it will multiply beyond belief. Now, the same is with as it is with the lotus, it is with sowing of spiritual ideas. We know that there's a great type of work involved in giving them root, but once rooted, they will proliferate. But they need, in our own mind, this seed, they need both breadth and depth in which to flourish. And you could say that within each one of us, there must be that unique effort, self-devised effort, to turn back within the soil of one's own being, and then to release the self-born nourishment of the spiritual plant. Now, the expression self-born nourishment is very interesting. What is it in each one of us? If we look back on our life, when was that point when we first became awakened to the idea of there's something like a spiritual world? When did we start to view ourselves as something more than the personality? And what is that energy that takes place in us that consists of that crucial moment when we have our first awakening up to the spiritual ideas? Well, we think we would have to go all the way back to, I'm just going to see if I can change. So we have to go all the way back to before the universe was being formed. It is said before there was anything manifested, there arose a desire in, you could say, the absolute energy of compassion. And this beautiful quote from the Rig Veda, which I will read, says, "Desire first arose in it, which was the primal germ of mind, and which sages, searching with their intellect, have discovered in their heart to be the bond which connects entity with non-entity." So just that this, like this exists on a cosmic level, we would think that that very moment when we first wake up to the spiritual ideas, we have something that we could say corresponds to this Kamadevic energy within us, which connects us with our invisible nature, with our visible nature, spirit and matter, and so forth. Now I cannot move my slides any longer, Jerry.
Use your, in the lower left-hand corner of your screen.
Okay, thank you. So when we set out on a journey, we need to have some kind of compass or GPS, if you so want. So when we set out on the spiritual journey, we have to strike, you can say keynote to our travel, a keynote of the heart quality. And this has to be our motive throughout all our the whole of our spiritual path. I mean, there will be moments when we fall over and over again in our endeavors. But the important thing is that we do not lose track of our motive. And the motive within all the theosophical teaching is that of the heart doctrine of compassion, of which the lotus, you could say, is the blossoming of that compassion. Now, within each one of us, there is this bud of renunciation. We can read in the voice of the silence in the second fragment that the spiritual path is one. At the same time, it's unique to each one of us. But at the end of that path, it becomes twofold. There is the path of liberation and there is the path of renunciation. Now, the path of liberation has to do with a being who has realized his own spirituality and who has transcended its material desires. But there is still lingering the desire for eternal bliss of nirvana or moksha or heaven or whatever our tradition will name it. But then there is also that other type of being, a fully realized spiritual being who has, you could say, transcended not only its material desires, but also all spiritual desires. And what that implies, it is a being who has transcended the ultimate polarities, where there is no longer any distinction between you and me or the idea of separateness, but whereas the whole aim is to stay on, not to enter nirvana, but to stay on to help every sentient being reach that same point. Now, isn't that beautiful? You could say if it's called the fruit or the pod of the lotus, you can see that in each of these cavities, you see these small seeds. And in each of these seeds, there is a perfectly formed petal lotus flower to be. And you could say the same thing it is with us. Within the cavity of our heart, we have this potential, the seed to become a bodhisattva. And sometimes in the Buddhist literature, it has been called the bhumis of compassion. And we would like to hear this quote being read, please.
Let thy soul lend its ear to every cry of pain, like as the lotus bears its heart to drink the morning sun. Let not the fierce sun dry one tear of pain before thyself has wiped it from the sufferer's eye. But let each burning human tear drop on thy heart and there remain, nor ever brush it off until the pain that caused it is removed.
Thank you. So we can see that throughout the spiritual journey, the ethics plays the most important part, to follow one's heart, to be able to be authentic to one's heart. But then we come across this quite powerful statement in the Secret Doctrine, which claims that ethics are applied metaphysics. And we know that there are spiritual traditions that put a stronger emphasis on ethics and others that put on metaphysics. But I think what is unique with theosophy is that we don't see ethics and metaphysics as two separate things. Because in order to live a truly ethical life, we need to know our metaphysics. And in order to be able to truly understand metaphysics, we have to live an ethical life. So they go together. And you could say, well, what about metaphysics? What is the definition of metaphysics? Is it that you study mantras? Is it that you study occultism or magic? Or what is it? And there are so many definitions of the word metaphysics. But to make things extremely simplified for this talk, we can look upon metaphysics as being able to see the patterns of nature and the patterns of the spirit, involution and evolution. So cycles of spiritual development. Now in this beautiful image here of the lotus, it really symbolizes the spiritual journey. We can see that the lotus flower lets its seed sink through the water all the way down into the mud, or physical everyday life experience and existence. And there, as we heard before, the seeds need to take root and they have to be nourished by a spiritual motivation. And then it will take root. And we know at first the spiritual ideas remain quite intellectual. And then, we are put into the nitty-gritty of everyday life where we have to test them out. And so as much as we can apply the ethics in everyday life, then they will start to sprout and they will take root, and then we will have the stem of the flower that pushes through the different layers of water. And the water, you could say, has sometimes been viewed as a different level of the astral world. And we have to go through all the way through the astral up into the Akashic world, where you could say that the bud penetrates through the surface of the water, and then the blossoming takes place as the fully, you could say, realized spiritual path. And I think it was you, John, who said last week that symbols, when we start up on the path, symbols, something like an object. It's very pictorial. But you could also say, as we move on, the symbol is a process. And we see this very much with abstract painters. They start off with an object, a picture of something that we can see what it is, and then they go on to develop it into the more and more geometrical figures. So we could see that another way of looking up on the lotus here on the left-hand side would be this diagram from page 200 of The Secret Doctrine, which actually tells the same story of the spiritual evolutionary path. We have the flower of the lotus symbolized by an aspect of the triangle who drops its seed from the universal consciousness. You could say each spark of that universal consciousness, each monadic essence, travels all the way down through the different layers of substance and you could say states of consciousness, comes all the way down to the circle at the bottom, which is really where we get stuck in the mud. And then from there, we have to use the spiritual ideas in order to evolve back out of matter up again to the spiritual aspect. And there we will have a fully realized lotus flower blossoming. So you could say that the spiritual journey is a process. It's a process of gradually shifting our point of identification. Most of us, if we really, really scrutinize our everyday life, we are probably caught up to quite a high percentage in identifying with our personality. But in order to walk the spiritual path or the anti-Quranic path, which the symbolism also is indicating with a lotus flower, we have to establish for ourselves a wider, broader perspective. So we have to start to look upon ourselves as a spiritual being. We have to widen our perspective, so it's not just one lifetime, but we have to see it over many lifetimes. And the individuality, we could say, is that aspect within ourselves that gives us the feeling of I am I. It is that, you could say, jewel in the lotus. And that individuality goes on from life to life to life. And it's also in our everyday life, that aspect in us, which can perceive all the changes that take place in our everyday life, in the body, in the emotions, in the thought patterns, and still it remains the same. And then we can, of course, in order to fully blossom as a lotus, we need also to get a universal point of identification, that we are one with that universal consciousness that shines through in all sentient beings. And when we are able to blossom like that, we are also able to, say that we have fully realized the spiritual path. Now, there's something very interesting. There's something called the creative forces or the higher cities latent in man. And those higher forces, they are energies. And they are said in The Voice of the Silence to be 7 keys to unlock and activate those energies within ourselves. We have these 7 keys here, and we are going to dive into them and explore them together a little bit in just a short while. Now, these are said to be golden keys. And the golden key is no one else than ourselves. We are the key to unlock these different, you could say, parameters or virtues. But I don't know about you guys, but my key is extremely rusty and more iron-like than golden-like. So in order to transform and to be able to unlock those energy within ourselves, which are actually the energies of the 7 hierarchies of the Dhyani Buddhas, we have to sort of polish our key, and that's, you could say, what the paramitas are about. Now, it's an interesting phenomenon. You may recall that it's said in our literature that if Hatma or a master of wisdom, they have to be very cautious when they want to perform any kind of, psychic phenomena, like materializing something or doing something, because whatever energy is spent from their side will also be available to the other darker side, so to speak. So when we look upon things like love and hate, positive and negative, we should try and think of them not so much as, how to say, two totally different things, because we know that there is no such thing as absolutely good or absolutely bad. It's all relative, and what makes it either good or bad is the motive with which we use that power. For example, black and white magic. What makes magic black is when we have a selfish motive, and what makes it white is when we have a white motive. So let's see how this plays out in our own spiritual development if we follow the paramitas. The first paramita, Dana, the key of charity and love immortal. Now, I guess I'm not the only one who's tried, desperately to apply this, to be a little bit more compassionate in everyday life. And the moment we put our devotional heart energy in that direction, we will immediately evoke its opposite. Never have I felt so uncharitable, selfish, mean as when I try to be good. And it's very easy to get despondent, but if we understand that there is no other way to develop spiritually, because everything in our nature that is not compatible with what we are aiming for needs to come up to the surface. We cannot deal with something unless it has become visible to us, obvious. So instead of feeling discouraged, we should actually welcome it, because it means that we are on the right track. Now, if we take the second paramita, that of Shila, harmony in thought, word, and act that leaves no further room for karmic action. So I wake up in the morning and I said to myself, I'm going to try to be authentic in my thought, in my word and act. So an hour later, I arrive at work, I sit at a conference, and I very soon realized that if I would actually say what I thought at that moment, or if I would act it out, I would probably lose my job. So from that perspective, we are not only tested by the different qualities of negativity of the opposite poles coming up in us, but we are also immediately challenged by the circumstances of life. So when we try and walk the spiritual path, you could say that karma gets intensified. It comes up quicker to the surface as well. Now, the next paramita is Shanti, patience sweet that naught can ruffle. What patience, we have a tendency to think that it has to do with being impatient about time. But what patience truly is the capacity to bring in an awareness in each present moment. It means that when you're listening to a person, you don't let your mind stray elsewhere. You try and still your mind, you try to be in the present moment. And in that sense, you could say that true patience is actually compatible, or can be likened to a full trust in the karmic law. That whatever will arise as a challenge in our life, if we can make that present awareness in the moment, we see it as opportunities instead of punishment and reward. Now, say that you sit down for meditation. Anyone who tried it, you want to try and focus, you want to try and stay in the present moment. Well, what happens? As one of my very dear companions on the path said the other day, never have my nose itched as much as when I sit down to meditate. well, there is that restless energy in the body that makes itself known. My joint squeaks, my muscle aches, I cannot sit still. And then my thoughts starts to spin around. They sort of rustle back and forth, and so with emotions. What am I going to make for lunch? Oh, I forgot to buy this or that thing. And you see how the everyday mind is sort of shattering our capacity to stay in the present moment. Now, you could say as an extension of patience is viraga. And viraga is the fourth parameter. It's kind of a tipping point. We call it equanimity and discernment. It's that power in us that makes us be able to meet, hopes and fears, all the pairs of opposites with sort of how could you say it, a higher type of indifference. It has nothing to do with being cold or indifferent, but to take it as an opportunity to learn. And it is said that for truly realized spiritual beings that have transcended those pairs of opposite and that can meet everything in life as if it would be the best that could happen because one could learn from it, then you could say what happens for such a being is that the virya, the fifth parameter, which is an aspect of the spiritual will, when it becomes free from personal desires, it starts to activate all those forces in us, and it sort of brings us up into the state of the next parameter, which is that of dhyana, perfect concentration, perfect awareness. It is when the mind and heart has been cleansed out of, you could say, concepts, the conceptual mind. It's when the mind becomes luminous, when it is, you could say, illumined by the light of buddhi or intuition or discernments. And then this is when the lotus flower reaches above the surface of the water and can reflect the prajna, or you could say the wisdom of compassion. That is the sun's beams that can now be reflected in the fully realized being. Now, something that is totally detrimental to the spiritual path is when we become too serious. Humor is absolutely necessary to walk the path. And you could say that in some ways we have to realize that we are spiritual beings and that we are here to guide our personality a little bit more in the right direction. Our personality is our aspect of nature that we need to respect, but that we also gently have to discipline to walk the right way. And there is nothing more, you could say, liberating than bringing the sense of humor to it, because the personality becomes dead serious. It's my thoughts, it's my idea, it's my philosophy, it's my perception of reality that is the only correct one. I think we can all recognize it. So I would like to end this talk with a small story from a Swedish author, a man who is now in his 50s called Björn Lindeberg. He has written a book about it, his life. And at the age of 22, he was a very, very well-known investor. And each morning, and he had everything in life when it comes to material objects. He had a beach house in Spain that for a Swede is the luxury of luxuries. He also had a sailboat, he had a fine car, and he had all the good things in material life. And each morning before he went out to see his clients, he will look himself into the mirror, he will correct his tie, and he will wink at himself in the mirror and smile, and he said, "You can do it, Björn." And then off he went. And he kind of sort of manipulated people into believing that they should invest in things that Björn himself didn't really believe in. Then came the day when he looked in the mirror, he sort of arranged his tie, and he sees that he can no longer make it. He can no longer fake it. And he hears this voice inside himself that there must be something more. There must be something else than this material life, because obviously it's not satisfying to him. So within a week, he has left his position as an investor. He has sold off all his material goods. And then he moves to Thailand, to the north of Thailand. He becomes a monk for 16 years within the Buddhist forest monk tradition. And this specific type of tradition don't deal with metaphysics, don't deal with mantras, don't deal with any occultism. They just want to try and learn to be in the present moment. And they're totally dependent on donations. So they live a quite simple life, a little bit like in some Zen monasteries. And the high points of the year for these monks are that there comes some type of teacher from another monastery that will give some talks in the evening. And this is one of the events in the evening where the monks are sitting lined up like lighted candles and very tentatively, because the teacher who has arrived is a very famous teacher known for its wisdom. So the teacher starts off with saying, tonight I'm going to impart to you the most important mantra that you will ever learn. And the monks, they sort of glare and glance at each other a little bit discreetly. And they say, what is this? Has he gone off the bend? We don't have any mantras without in our tradition. So what is all this about? But then the teacher goes on and he said, you know what? This is such a useful mantra for checking the personal ego, to put it off balance and to check it and to control it. And the good thing is, you have to repeat it 3 times loud whenever you encounter a situation, whether it's a conflict, whether it's a philosophical discussion or any challenging situation in life. You have to repeat it 3 times, but you have to be perfectly concentrated on when you say it. And he also says, you can repeat it in any language. It doesn't need to be Sanskrit or Pali. So now he has really got the attention of the monks. And so he said, are you ready? And then the teacher says, I may be wrong. The monks are sort of looking sideways and thinking, is there something else to it? And then the teacher said a second time, I may be wrong. And then a third time, I may be wrong. There is nothing more challenging to the personal ego to be wrong. And it helps us. This is a very useful mantra. I would encourage you to try it. It's very interesting, very tickling. And you know, it also means that when we can admit that we may be wrong, we are ready to let other people's viewpoint in. And so we can get a more nourishing view of the whole teaching. And isn't this what the flowering of Lotus is all about? So thank you for listening.